In the dim candlelight of his study in Sant'Andrea in Percasina, Niccolò Machiavelli sat contemplating the ruins of his political career. The year was 1513, and the man who had once advised princes now found himself exiled from Florence, stripped of power, and forced to confront a truth more brutal than any battlefield defeat. The enemy that had truly destroyed him was not the Medici family or foreign armies, but the weakness he had harbored within himself. As he penned what would become The Prince, Machiavelli understood that political power was merely the external manifestation of an internal conquest. The real battle was not fought in the courts of Renaissance Italy, but in the chambers of the human heart, where sentiment and weakness conspired to deliver even the mightiest to their knees. What emerged from his exile was not just a treatise on statecraft, but a ruthless emotional philosophy that would echo through the centuries. To become truly indestructible, one must first destroy the parts of oneself that invite destruction. The philosophy Machiavelli developed during those lonely months in exile was revolutionary not because it advocated cruelty, but because it recognized that the greatest cruelty was the kindness we show to our own weaknesses. He had watched Florence's leaders fall not to superior enemies, but to their own inability to let go of what no longer served them. They clung to outdated alliances, cherished relationships that had soured, and nursed grievances that poisoned their judgment. In their mercy toward their own flawed thinking, they had become merciless toward their own success. This document chronicles the three fundamental principles that Machiavelli discovered in his darkest hour, principles that transform the way we understand emotional intelligence, personal power, and the art of letting go. These are not mere psychological insights, but weapons forged in the crucible of political defeat and personal reckoning. They represent a complete inversion of conventional wisdom about human nature, relationships, and the path to invulnerability. The first principle concerns the recognition that our emotional attachments are often our greatest vulnerabilities. Machiavelli observed that rulers fell not when they were hated, but when they loved too much, when they clung to advisors who had betrayed them, to strategies that had failed, to images of themselves that no longer matched reality. The man who cannot release his grip on what is already dead will find that death eventually claims him as well. The second principle addresses the necessity of emotional pragmatism over emotional idealism. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli witnessed countless nobles destroyed by their commitment to how things should be rather than how things actually were. They spoke of honor while dishonor surrounded them, of loyalty while betrayal flourished, of justice while corruption reigned. Their unwillingness to adapt their emotional responses to reality left them emotionally bankrupt when reality finally demanded payment. The third principle reveals the paradox of strength through surrender. Machiavelli discovered that true power comes not from holding on, but from the strategic ability to let go completely. The prince who could abandon a failing siege to fight another day survived, while the one who committed everything to a single battle perished with his cause. In personal terms, this meant developing the capacity to release relationships, beliefs, and even aspects of identity that had become liabilities rather than assets. These principles form what Machiavelli privately called his emotional playbook, a systematic approach to managing the internal forces that could either elevate or destroy a person's external power. Unlike his public writings, which focused on political maneuvering, this private philosophy dealt with the psychological maneuvering required to maintain clarity, strength, and effectiveness in a world that constantly sought to exploit human emotional weaknesses. The genius of Machiavelli's approach lies not in its coldness, but in its clarity. He understood that mercy toward one's own weaknesses was the highest form of cruelty toward one's own potential. The leader who could not bring himself to dismiss a failing advisor would eventually fail his entire kingdom. The individual who could not release a toxic relationship would eventually poison all his relationships. The person who could not let go of past hurts would eventually be imprisoned by them. What follows is an exploration of how these principles operate not just in the rarefied air of political power, but in the daily struggles of anyone seeking to build a life of meaning, impact, and resilience. Machiavelli's insights apply as much to the modern professional navigating corporate politics as they did to Renaissance princes navigating dynastic wars. They speak to anyone who has ever found themselves weakened by their own inability to let go, anyone who has discovered that their greatest enemy was not external opposition, but internal attachment. The journey through Machiavelli's emotional playbook is not comfortable. It demands that we examine our most cherished beliefs about loyalty, love, forgiveness, and hope with the same analytical rigor that we might apply to a military campaign or business strategy. It asks us to consider whether our emotional habits serve our actual goals or merely our psychological comfort. It challenges us to become as strategic about our inner lives as we are about our outer ones. Yet for those willing to undertake this examination, the rewards are profound. The person who masters Machiavelli's emotional principles discovers a kind of freedom that few ever experience: freedom from the tyranny of their own attachments, freedom from the manipulation of others who would exploit their emotional vulnerabilities, freedom from the endless cycle of hope and disappointment that characterizes most human experience. This is the story of how to become emotionally indestructible, not through hardness, but through fluidity; not through isolation, but through strategic engagement; not through caring about nothing, but through caring so intelligently that nothing can use your caring against you. It is the story of how the man who destroys his weak self becomes truly undestroyable, because there is nothing left in him for his enemies to attack. Part 1: The Archaeology of Attachment. In the autumn of 1512, as Machiavelli watched the government he had served for 14 years crumble around him, he made a discovery that would reshape his understanding of human nature forever. Standing in his office in the Palazzo Vecchio for the last time, surrounded by the maps and diplomatic correspondence that had defined his career, he realized that his downfall had not come from any external enemy, but from his own inability to recognize when his attachments had become anchors. The revelation struck him with the force of a physical blow. For months, he had blamed his exile on the return of the Medici family, on the changing political winds, on the fickleness of fortune. But, as he traced the sequence of events that had led to his disgrace, a different pattern emerged. At every crucial moment, his judgment had been compromised not by lack of information or strategic insight, but by his emotional investment in outcomes that were already beyond salvation. He had clung to the Republic when its death throes were already visible. He had continued to trust advisors whose loyalty had clearly shifted. He had poured energy into diplomatic relationships that were already hollow. Most damaging of all, he had remained committed to a version of himself, the indispensable counselor, the master strategist, that no longer matched the political reality around him. His attachments, he realized, had become a kind of emotional archaeology, each layer representing a past that no longer existed but continued to influence his present decisions. This insight would become the foundation of his emotional philosophy: that human beings are constantly carrying the debris of dead relationships, obsolete beliefs, and expired identities, and that this emotional archaeology makes them vulnerable to manipulation and defeat. The strong person, he concluded, must become skilled at excavating these buried attachments and discarding them with the same ruthlessness that a military commander shows toward compromised positions. Machiavelli began to study attachment as if it were a military science. He observed that people formed emotional connections according to certain predictable patterns, and that these patterns could be mapped, analyzed, and strategically managed. He noticed that most individuals were unconsciously loyal to attachments that had long since stopped serving them, like soldiers continuing to defend a fortress that had already been abandoned by its commanders. The first pattern he identified was what he termed phantom loyalty, the tendency to remain emotionally committed to people and institutions that had already demonstrated their unreliability. He had seen this repeatedly in political life: nobles who continued to support leaders who had betrayed them, diplomats who persisted in negotiations that had clearly failed, advisors who remained devoted to princes who no longer valued their counsel. In his own case, he recognized that he had maintained phantom loyalty to a republic that had already chosen to sacrifice him for political expediency. The mechanism of phantom loyalty, he realized, was hope disguised as principle. People convinced themselves that their continued attachment represented virtue, loyalty, perseverance, faith, when it actually represented an inability to face disappointing realities. They preferred the familiar pain of unrequited loyalty to the unfamiliar challenge of seeking new alliances. This emotional conservatism, Machiavelli observed, was one of the primary ways that intelligent people destroyed themselves. The second pattern was identity inertia, the resistance to updating one's self-concept even when circumstances had fundamentally changed. Machiavelli had watched numerous political figures continue to operate according to outdated understandings of their own power and influence long after events had rendered these self-concepts obsolete. They negotiated as if they still commanded armies they no longer controlled, made demands based on relationships that had already soured, and assumed levels of respect and influence that existed only in their own minds. His own identity inertia had been particularly costly. Even as the political landscape shifted around him, he had continued to see himself as the indispensable architect of Florentine foreign policy. This self-image had prevented him from recognizing the signs of his own vulnerability and taking steps to protect himself. When the Medici returned to power, they found him still operating according to assumptions about his own importance that they did not share. The third pattern was strategic sentimentality, the habit of making important decisions based on emotional comfort rather than practical effectiveness. Machiavelli observed that people often maintained relationships, commitments, and beliefs not because they were beneficial, but because abandoning them felt cruel or disloyal. They confused kindness toward their own feelings with actual kindness, not recognizing that this false mercy often led to genuine cruelty toward themselves and others. He had witnessed strategic sentimentality destroy numerous political careers. Leaders who kept incompetent advisors because they could not bear to dismiss old friends found their entire administrations weakened. Diplomats who honored agreements that no longer served their interests discovered that their perceived reliability made them predictably exploitable. Nobles who maintained expensive households out of family obligation found themselves financially vulnerable when they needed resources for genuine emergencies. What made these patterns particularly dangerous, Machiavelli realized, was that they operated below the level of conscious awareness. People experienced phantom loyalty as virtue, identity inertia as consistency, and strategic sentimentality as compassion. They defended these patterns against external criticism and internal doubt, creating elaborate justifications for behaviors that systematically undermine their own interests. The solution, he concluded, required developing what he privately termed attachment consciousness, the ability to observe one's own emotional investments with the same analytical detachment that a general might use to assess troop positions. This meant learning to distinguish between attachments that served actual purposes and attachments that served only psychological comfort. It meant becoming willing to abandon emotional investments that had become liabilities, regardless of how much had already been invested in them. Machiavelli began practicing this discipline in his own life during his exile. He systematically examined each of his relationships, beliefs, and self-concepts, asking not whether they felt important to him, but whether they served his actual goals and circumstances. The exercise was initially excruciating. He discovered that much of what he had considered his core identity was actually a collection of expired attachments to positions he no longer held, to people who no longer trusted him, to political arrangements that no longer existed. But, as he released these attachments, something unexpected happened. Rather than feeling diminished, he felt lighter and more focused. Energy that had been trapped in maintaining defunct emotional investments was suddenly available for new projects. Mental clarity that had been clouded by conflicting loyalties became sharp and decisive. Most importantly, he discovered that by becoming less attached to specific outcomes, he became more effective at achieving the outcomes that actually mattered to him. This led him to a counterintuitive insight: the person who was willing to lose everything was nearly impossible to defeat, because defeat required taking away something that the person was unwilling to release. The leader who could not bear to dismiss failing advisors could be controlled through those advisors. The individual who could not tolerate the loss of a particular relationship could be manipulated through that relationship. But, the person who held all attachments lightly was like water able to flow around obstacles that would destroy more rigid opponents. The practice of attachment consciousness also revealed to him the extent to which emotional manipulation operated through the exploitation of attachments. Enemies gained power over their targets not through superior force, but by identifying what the target was unwilling to lose and, then, threatening those attachments. The prince who could not bear to see his subjects suffer could be controlled through threats to civilian populations. The diplomat who prized his reputation for honesty could be compromised by creating situations where honesty would damage his career. Machiavelli began to see attachment as a form of voluntary vulnerability. Every deep emotional investment was essentially giving an enemy a weapon to use against you. This did not mean that attachments should be avoided entirely. They were often necessary for achieving important goals, but they should be formed and maintained strategically, with full awareness of the risks they created. He developed a practice of regularly conducting what he called attachment audits, systematic examinations of his emotional investments to determine which ones still served his purposes and which ones had become sources of weakness. This involved asking brutal questions: Which relationships were based on mutual benefit versus mere habit? Which beliefs reflected current reality versus past comfort? Which aspects of his identity were actually useful versus simply familiar? The attachment audit process was not about becoming emotionless or disconnected. Rather, it was about ensuring that his emotional investments were conscious, strategic, and aligned with his actual values and goals. He found that by regularly pruning his attachments, the remaining ones became stronger and more meaningful. By being willing to let go of relationships that had become hollow, he deepened his appreciation for relationships that remained vital. By releasing beliefs that no longer served him, he became more committed to beliefs that actually guided his decisions. Perhaps most significantly, Machiavelli discovered that the practice of letting go without mercy was itself a form of mercy toward his own potential, mercy toward his actual relationships, mercy toward his genuine goals. The cruelty lay not in the releasing, but in the clinging to what was already dead. The person who could not let go of a failing marriage poisoned whatever love remained. The leader who could not abandon a failing strategy wasted resources that could be used for successful strategies. The individual who could not release a destructive friendship often lost the opportunity for more constructive relationships. This realization became the cornerstone of his emotional philosophy, that true loyalty to anything, a person, a cause, a goal, sometimes required the willingness to abandon the forms that loyalty had previously taken. The general who truly served his country might need to retreat from battles in order to win wars. The friend who truly cared about someone might need to end a relationship that had become mutually destructive. The person who truly valued his own potential might need to abandon familiar identities that had become constraining. The archaeology of attachment, Machiavelli concluded, was an ongoing process. Human beings constantly formed new emotional investments, and these investments constantly needed to be examined for their continued relevance and utility. The moment someone stopped conducting these examinations was the moment they began to accumulate the emotional debris that would eventually bury them. But, for those willing to undertake this work, the rewards were transformative. They became like master architects of their own emotional lives, able to build and rebuild their internal structures according to their evolving needs and circumstances. They discovered a kind of freedom that most people never experienced, freedom from the tyranny of their own past decisions, freedom from the manipulation of others who would exploit their attachments, freedom from the endless cycle of hope and disappointment that characterized most human relationships. This was the first and, perhaps most fundamental principle of Machiavelli's emotional playbook, that strength came not from the intensity of one's attachments, but from the intelligence with which those attachments were formed and maintained. The person who mastered this principle became like a military commander who could deploy and redeploy his forces according to changing battlefield conditions, always ready to abandon positions that had become indefensible, always focused on the ultimate victory rather than any particular engagement. Part 2, The Pragmatism of Emotional Reality. The second revelation came to Machiavelli during a chance encounter in the marketplace of San Casciano, 6 months into his exile. He was purchasing vegetables when he overheard two merchants arguing about a business deal gone wrong. One merchant, whom Machiavelli recognized as once prosperous, was insisting that his former partner had betrayed their friendship by renegotiating terms that had been agreed upon in good faith. The other merchant, clearly more successful now, replied with brutal simplicity, "Business is business. You expected loyalty where none was promised. That expectation was your mistake, not my betrayal." As Machiavelli walked home, the conversation echoed in his mind. He realized that the failing merchant's error was not trusting the wrong person, but operating according to emotional assumptions that had no basis in reality. The man had confused his desire for loyal partnership with the actual nature of the relationship. He had imposed a framework of friendship onto what was fundamentally a commercial transaction, and, when reality failed to match his emotional interpretation, he experienced it as betrayal rather than simply information about the true nature of the arrangement. This insight crystallized into what would become the second pillar of his emotional philosophy, the distinction between emotional idealism and emotional pragmatism. He began to understand that most human suffering came not from difficult realities, but from the collision between reality and emotionally comforting illusions about reality. People constructed elaborate emotional narratives about their relationships, their work, their future prospects, and then experienced genuine anguish when facts refused to conform to these narratives. Machiavelli started observing this pattern everywhere. He saw parents devastated when their children chose different paths than what the parents had imagined, not because the chosen paths were necessarily worse, but because they contradicted cherished fantasies about family destiny. He watched political allies feeling betrayed when others acted according to their own interests rather than according to assumed bonds of loyalty that had never been explicitly established. He noticed individuals suffering through obviously failing strategies because acknowledging the failure would require abandoning romantic notions about their own capabilities or circumstances. The mechanism at work, he realized, was a form of emotional narcissism. People created internal stories about how relationships, institutions, and circumstances should operate based on their own desires and assumptions, then expected reality to conform to these private narratives. When reality inevitably diverged from these expectations, they experienced it as a personal affront rather than simply information about how things actually worked. This emotional narcissism was particularly destructive because it prevented people from adapting to actual conditions. Instead of observing what was happening and adjusting their strategies accordingly, they expended energy trying to force reality to match their preferred version of events. The merchant in the marketplace was a perfect example. Rather than recognizing that his business relationship had always been transactional and adapting his approach accordingly, he was wasting time and emotional energy lamenting the absence of a loyalty that had never actually existed. Machiavelli began to distinguish between two fundamentally different approaches to emotional life. Emotional idealists operated according to how they thought things should work, based on their personal values, desires, and assumptions. Emotional pragmatists operated according to how things actually did work, based on observed patterns and demonstrated realities. The idealists were constantly disappointed, confused, and vulnerable to manipulation. The pragmatists were consistently effective, resilient, and difficult to exploit. The difference was not that pragmatists lacked emotions or values, but that they grounded their emotional responses in accurate assessments of actual conditions rather than wishful thinking about preferred conditions. A pragmatic approach to love, for example, would be based on observing how a person actually behaved over time rather than on assumptions about how someone who loved you should behave. A pragmatic approach to business would be based on demonstrated patterns of reliability and mutual benefit rather than on hopes about future loyalty or commitment. This distinction revolutionized Machiavelli's understanding of his own political downfall. He had operated according to emotional idealism, assuming that his long service to the Republic created a kind of implicit loyalty that would protect him during political transitions. He had imagined that his competence and dedication had earned him a security that transcended partisan politics. These assumptions felt morally correct and emotionally satisfying, but they had no basis in the actual functioning of political power. A more pragmatic approach would have recognized that political loyalty was always conditional and temporary, based on current utility rather than past service. It would have acknowledged that competence was valuable only as long as it served the interests of those in power. It would have prepared for the possibility of political changes that could render his position vulnerable regardless of his past contributions. The difference between idealism and pragmatism became particularly clear to him when he examined successful versus unsuccessful political careers. The leaders who survived and thrived were typically those who operated according to accurate assessments of how power actually functioned, even when these assessments contradicted their personal preferences or moral ideals. They built alliances based on mutual interest rather than personal affection. They made decisions based on likely outcomes rather than desired outcomes. They prepared for betrayal not because they were cynical, but because they understood that loyalty was always subject to changing circumstances and priorities. Conversely, the leaders who failed were often those who insisted on operating according to how they thought politics should work rather than how it actually worked. They trusted where trust was not warranted, assumed loyalty where only temporary alliance existed, and expected consistency from institutions that were fundamentally fluid and opportunistic. Machiavelli realized that emotional idealism was particularly dangerous because it felt virtuous. People defended their unrealistic expectations as evidence of their high moral standards rather than recognizing them as strategic errors. The merchant who expected friendship in business relationships could present himself as someone who valued human connection over mere profit. The political leader who assumed permanent loyalty could portray himself as someone who believed in honor and mutual commitment. But these apparently admirable qualities became sources of weakness when they prevented accurate assessment of actual conditions. The practice of emotional pragmatism, he discovered, required developing what he termed reality consciousness, the ability to observe situations as they actually were rather than as one hoped or feared they might be. This meant learning to distinguish between information and interpretation, between what was actually happening and what one's emotional preferences suggested should be happening. Reality consciousness involved several specific disciplines. The first was evidence-based assessment, forming conclusions about relationships and situations based on observed patterns of behavior rather than on promises, intentions, or assumptions. If someone consistently acted in ways that served their own interests at the expense of others, that pattern was more reliable information about future behavior than any declarations of loyalty or commitment they might make. The second discipline was temporal awareness, recognizing that all relationships and circumstances existed within specific contexts that could change. A business partnership that worked well during prosperity might function differently during economic stress. A political alliance that made sense under one set of conditions might become inappropriate when those conditions changed. Emotional pragmatists planned for these changes rather than assuming that current arrangements were permanent. The third discipline was interest analysis, understanding that people and institutions typically acted according to their perceived interests rather than according to abstract principles or personal affections. This did not mean assuming that everyone was selfish or dishonest, but rather recognizing that even genuine care and commitment operated within frameworks of personal and institutional interests that could shift over time. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of emotional pragmatism was learning to apply these disciplines to oneself. Machiavelli found that he was often as unrealistic about his own motivations and capabilities as he had been about external circumstances. He had to learn to observe his own behavior patterns, to acknowledge his own limitations, and to recognize when his own interests conflicted with his stated principles. This self-examination revealed uncomfortable truths. He discovered that many of his apparently altruistic motivations contained significant elements of self-interest. His dedication to the Republic, for example, was inseparable from his personal investment in being seen as indispensable. His diplomatic efforts were motivated not just by patriotic concern, but by his desire to be recognized as a master strategist. His willingness to serve had always been conditional on receiving the recognition and influence that made service rewarding. Recognizing these mixed motivations did not diminish the value of his contributions, but it did clarify the actual dynamics underlying his political relationships. His colleagues had responded to his self-interest as much as to his competence, and they had withdrawn support when his personal agenda began to conflict with their own priorities. Understanding this pattern helped him avoid similar miscalculations in future relationships. The practice of emotional pragmatism also transformed his understanding of manipulation and exploitation. He realized that these usually succeeded not through force or deception, but through the exploitation of emotional idealism. Manipulators identified what people wanted to believe about themselves, their relationships, or their circumstances, and then provided apparent confirmation of these beliefs in exchange for compliance or resources. The merchant who had been cheated, for example, had been vulnerable because he wanted to believe that his business relationships were also personal friendships. A skilled manipulator could exploit this desire by providing the appearance of friendship while extracting business advantages. The manipulation succeeded not because the victim was stupid, but because his emotional idealism prevented him from recognizing the actual nature of the transaction. Similarly, Machiavelli's own vulnerability had come from his desire to believe that his political relationships were based on mutual respect and shared commitment to Florentine interests. This idealistic interpretation had prevented him from recognizing the purely transactional nature of political alliances and preparing accordingly for changes in political conditions. Emotional pragmatists were much more difficult to manipulate because they based their responses on demonstrated realities rather than on desired beliefs. They might hope for loyalty, but they planned for betrayal. They might value friendship, but they recognized when relationships were primarily instrumental. They might prefer cooperation, but they prepared for competition. This did not make them cynical or pessimistic. Many pragmatists were actually more optimistic than idealists because their expectations were based on realistic assessments rather than on wishful thinking.
When good things happened, they could appreciate them without the anxiety that came from knowing they were unsustainable. When bad things happened, they could respond effectively rather than being paralyzed by disappointment.
The transformation from idealism to pragmatism, Machiavelli found, was not a loss of humanity but a refinement of humanity. It meant caring about outcomes more than about maintaining comfortable illusions. It meant loving people for who they actually were rather than for who one hoped they might become. It meant working toward goals based on accurate assessment of what was possible rather than on romantic notions about what should be possible. Most importantly, emotional pragmatism created a foundation for genuine strength and reliability. People who operated according to accurate assessments of reality could make commitments they could actually keep, form relationships based on mutual understanding rather than mutual delusion, and build projects that could withstand contact with actual conditions rather than existing only in the realm of good intentions. The pragmatic approach to letting go was particularly powerful. Instead of clinging to relationships or commitments because abandoning them felt wrong, pragmatists could release what was not working in order to preserve what was valuable. Instead of maintaining failing strategies because admitting failure felt like personal defeat, they could adapt their methods in order to achieve their actual goals. This approach required a fundamental shift in how success and failure were understood. Emotional idealists often experienced any deviation from their preferred scenarios as failure, even when the actual outcomes were beneficial. Emotional pragmatists measured success by results rather than by adherence to predetermined expectations, making them more likely to recognize and build on whatever positive developments actually occurred. The merchant in the marketplace, for example, could have responded to his partner's self-interested behavior as useful information about how to structure future business relationships rather than as a betrayal requiring emotional processing. He could have adapted his approach to achieve better business outcomes rather than expending energy lamenting the absence of friendship that had never really existed. Machiavelli came to see this shift as perhaps the most liberating aspect of his emotional philosophy. Once he stopped expecting reality to conform to his preferences, he became free to work with reality as it actually was. This made him more effective at achieving his actual goals and more resilient when faced with unexpected challenges. The person who mastered emotional pragmatism, he concluded, became like a skilled sailor who worked with wind and current rather than fighting against them. Such a person could navigate storms that would destroy those who insisted that the weather should be different. They could reach their destinations even when the journey required routes that differed from their original plans. They could build lives of genuine accomplishment and satisfaction because their efforts were based on accurate understanding of the conditions within which they were operating. Part 3, The Paradox of Strength Through Surrender. The third and most profound revelation came to Machiavelli during the harshest winter of his exile, as he sat before a dying fire in his humble country house, contemplating a letter from his former colleague Francesco Guicciardini. The letter contained an offer to help restore Machiavelli to political favor, but it came with conditions that would require him to publicly repudiate many of his previous positions and demonstrate loyalty to the very Medici regime that had exiled him. As he stared into the fading embers, Machiavelli found himself confronting a choice that crystallized everything he had learned about the nature of power and vulnerability. He could fight to reclaim his old position by compromising his principles, essentially trading his intellectual integrity for political rehabilitation. Or he could surrender his attachment to political power entirely and focus on understanding and documenting the principles of effective leadership that his exile had revealed to him. The conventional understanding of strength would have demanded that he fight to return to power, that he never surrender what had been taken from him unjustly. But, as he contemplated his options, Machiavelli realized that this conventional understanding was precisely what had made him vulnerable in the first place. His attachment to maintaining his political position had prevented him from recognizing when that position was becoming untenable. His unwillingness to consider alternative paths had left him with no options when his preferred path was closed. In that moment of recognition, he made a decision that would define the remainder of his life and establish the final pillar of his emotional philosophy. He would surrender his claim to political power completely, not as an act of defeat, but as a strategic choice that would give him a different kind of power entirely. By releasing his attachment to what he had lost, he would become free to pursue what he might gain. This decision revealed to him the most counterintuitive principle of his entire emotional system, that true strength often required the willingness to surrender completely, not because surrender was inherently valuable, but because the act of surrendering what could not be held anyway freed up energy and attention for opportunities that might otherwise be missed. The person who could not let go of what was already lost became incapable of grasping what was newly available. Machiavelli began to understand surrender not as passive acceptance of defeat, but as an active strategy for maintaining freedom of action. When he surrendered his attachment to political rehabilitation, he discovered that he was no longer constrained by the need to say and do things that would be acceptable to those who controlled political access. He could think and write with a clarity that had been impossible when his ideas were filtered through considerations of political expediency. This intellectual freedom led to insights that would have been impossible if he had remained embedded in the political system. His exile forced him to observe power from the outside, to analyze patterns that were invisible to those caught up in daily political maneuvering. The very distance that had seemed like weakness became the source of a different kind of strength, the strength of perspective, of analysis, of understanding that transcended any particular political moment. The principle of strategic surrender, he realized, operated across every domain of human experience. In relationships, the person who could not bear to lose any connection often ended up trapped in relationships that had become destructive or stagnant. They invested enormous energy in maintaining connections that no longer served anyone involved, energy that could have been used to build new relationships or deepen existing ones that remained vital. In professional contexts, the person who could not release attachment to a particular role or status often missed opportunities for growth or adaptation that required temporary steps backward. They remained in positions that were becoming obsolete rather than developing skills and relationships that would be valuable in changing circumstances. In intellectual life, the person who could not surrender cherished beliefs when evidence contradicted them often became increasingly disconnected from reality, investing more energy in defending positions that facts had rendered untenable rather than developing new understanding based on actual conditions. The common element in all these situations was that the refusal to surrender what was already lost prevented the recognition and pursuit of what might be gained. The energy that went into clinging to the past was energy that was not available for engaging with the present or building the future. But Machiavelli discovered that effective surrender was not simple abandonment. It required what he came to think of as strategic release, a conscious decision to let go of specific attachments in service of larger goals. This was different from giving up in despair or abandoning all effort. It was a calculated choice to redirect energy from defending untenable positions to exploring new possibilities. Strategic release operated according to several key principles. The first was assessment of actual control, distinguishing between what could genuinely be influenced and what was beyond one's power to affect. Machiavelli had wasted enormous energy trying to control political outcomes that were determined by forces far beyond his influence. Once he accepted that these outcomes were not within his control, he could focus on what was his own thinking, writing, and analysis. The second principle was temporal perspective, recognizing that apparent defeats in the short term could become advantages in the long term if they were approached strategically. His exile from politics had seemed like an unmitigated disaster when it occurred, but it had also freed him to develop insights that would prove far more enduring than any particular political victory he might have achieved. The third principle was identity flexibility, maintaining a sense of core purpose and value that could survive the loss of specific roles, relationships, or circumstances. Machiavelli's identity had been so closely tied to his political position that losing that position had initially felt like losing himself. But, by developing a broader understanding of his value and purpose as a thinker, analyst, and observer of human nature, he had become less vulnerable to external changes in his circumstances. The fourth principle was opportunity alertness, remaining open to possibilities that might not have been visible when one was committed to a particular path. His focus on political rehabilitation had initially blinded him to the intellectual opportunities that his exile had created. Only when he surrendered his attachment to returning to his old life did he become capable of recognizing the value of his new circumstances. Perhaps the most challenging aspect of strategic release was learning to distinguish between temporary setbacks that should be fought and fundamental changes that required adaptation. The skill lay in recognizing when persistence served actual goals and when it served only psychological comfort. Machiavelli had to learn that continuing to fight for political restoration had become a form of emotional self-indulgence rather than a strategic choice. This recognition led him to develop criteria for determining when surrender was strategically appropriate. The first criterion was cost-benefit analysis, honestly assessing whether the energy required to maintain a particular attachment was producing proportional returns. His political rehabilitation would have required enormous compromises and might not have succeeded even then. The energy required was far greater than the likely benefits. The second criterion was alternative opportunity, considering whether holding on to current commitments was preventing the pursuit of potentially better alternatives. His attachment to political power had prevented him from seriously considering other ways of exercising influence and building legacy. Once he released that attachment, he could see possibilities that had been invisible before. The third criterion was alignment with core values, determining whether maintaining particular attachments was consistent with or contradictory to fundamental principles. The compromises required for political rehabilitation would have contradicted his commitment to intellectual honesty and analytical rigor. Surrendering his political ambitions actually served his deeper values more effectively than clinging to them would have. The practice of strategic release also revealed to him the psychological mechanisms that made surrender difficult. He discovered that people often confused attachment with commitment, clinging with loyalty, and persistence with strength. These confusions led them to continue investing in declining situations long after strategic wisdom would have recommended a different approach. The confusion between attachment and commitment was particularly destructive. True commitment, Machiavelli realized, was commitment to results, to values, to purposes. Attachment was often commitment to methods, to relationships, to identities that might no longer serve those deeper purposes. The person who was truly committed to political reform might need to surrender attachment to particular political parties or strategies. The person who was truly committed to personal growth might need to surrender attachment to comfortable identities or relationships. Similarly, the confusion between clinging and loyalty led people to maintain relationships or commitments that no longer served anyone involved. True loyalty sometimes required the wisdom to end relationships that had become destructive, to leave organizations that had lost their way, to abandon strategies that were producing harmful results. The person who truly cared about others might need to be willing to disappoint them in service of their long-term well-being. The confusion between persistence and strength was perhaps the most dangerous because it made surrender appear weak when it was actually the most difficult and courageous choice. It took no strength to continue in familiar patterns, even when those patterns were producing poor results. It took enormous strength to acknowledge when fundamental changes were necessary and to make those changes despite the discomfort and uncertainty they involved. Machiavelli's own experience of surrender had taught him that the initial discomfort of letting go was typically followed by a sense of relief and expansion. Once he stopped fighting to return to his old life, he experienced a kind of freedom he had never known during his political career. He was no longer constrained by the need to maintain relationships that had become politically necessary but personally empty. He was no longer required to support positions that were strategically expedient but intellectually dishonest. This freedom manifested in concrete ways. His writing became more honest and penetrating because he no longer needed to consider how his ideas might affect his political prospects. His relationships became more authentic because they were based on genuine connection rather than mutual utility. His daily life became more satisfying because it was aligned with his actual interests and capabilities rather than with external expectations about what someone of his background should be doing. The transformation also revealed to him the extent to which his previous life had been constrained by fears of loss. Much of his political maneuvering had been motivated not by positive vision of what he wanted to create, but by anxiety about what he might lose. This fear-based approach had made him reactive rather than proactive, defensive rather than creative. Once he had actually lost what he had been afraid of losing, he discovered that the reality was far less devastating than the anticipation had been. This insight led him to understand that much human weakness came from the fear of surrender rather than from surrender itself. People remain trapped in unsatisfying situations not because those situations were beneficial, but because the unknown alternatives seemed threatening. They preferred familiar problems to unfamiliar possibilities, known limitations to uncertain freedoms. The person who mastered strategic surrender, Machiavelli concluded, became truly indestructible because there was nothing left that could be taken away against their will. They had already demonstrated their ability to let go of whatever circumstances might require them to release. This did not make them indifferent to loss, but it made them resilient in the face of loss and, therefore, difficult for others to control or manipulate.
The power of this position was not theoretical.
Machiavelli found that once he had surrendered his attachment to political rehabilitation, he became immune to the various pressures and inducements that might have been used to control his thinking or behavior. Those who might have sought to influence him through promises of political favor discovered that such promises held no power over someone who had genuinely released attachment to political outcomes. Similarly, those who might have threatened him with further exile or disgrace found that these threats were ineffective against someone who had already accepted and adapted to his circumstances.
The person who had nothing left to lose in a particular domain could not be controlled through threats related to that domain.
This immunity extended beyond political matters to every area of life. The person who had surrendered attachment to others' opinions could not be manipulated through social pressure. The person who had released attachment to particular outcomes could not be controlled through promises or threats related to those outcomes. The person who had let go of specific identities could not be diminished by attacks on those identities. Yet this strength through surrender did not require becoming emotionless or disconnected. Machiavelli discovered that releasing attachment actually enhanced his capacity for appropriate engagement. When he was no longer driven by fear of loss, he could form relationships and commitments based on genuine value rather than on defensive necessity. When he was no longer constrained by the need to protect particular positions, he could explore ideas and possibilities with genuine curiosity rather than with protective anxiety. The practice of strategic surrender, he realized, was ultimately an expression of confidence rather than defeat. It required faith that one's core value and capability would remain intact regardless of external circumstances. It required trust that new opportunities would emerge if one remained alert and adaptable. It required courage to face uncertainty in exchange for freedom from constraints that had become limitations rather than protections. This confidence, faith, and courage were not abstract qualities but practical capabilities that could be developed through experience and reflection. Each successful act of strategic release built the foundation for greater flexibility and resilience in future challenges. Each demonstration that survival and growth were possible after letting go reduced the fear that made surrender seem impossible. The cumulative effect was the development of what Machiavelli termed fluid strength, the ability to maintain core purpose and effectiveness while adapting form and method to changing circumstances. Like water that could flow around obstacles that would break more rigid materials, the person who mastered strategic surrender could navigate challenges that would destroy those who insisted on maintaining fixed positions. This fluid strength became the ultimate expression of his emotional philosophy. The person who could let go without mercy when circumstances required it, who could operate according to reality rather than preferred illusions, and who could surrender strategically when holding on had become counterproductive, achieved a kind of invulnerability that no external force could penetrate. They became like Machiavelli himself in his exile, apparently defeated but actually liberated, seemingly weakened but actually strengthened, ostensibly surrendering but actually claiming a power that no one could take away. The man who destroys his weak self, he had discovered, cannot be destroyed by others because there is nothing weak left in him for his enemies to attack. He has become his own strongest ally and his own most effective protector, not through accumulating armor against the world, but through developing the flexibility to move with whatever the world might bring. In mastering the art of letting go, he had mastered the art of holding on to what truly mattered. In learning to surrender without mercy, he had discovered how to be genuinely unconquerable. Thus ends the document that Machiavelli never published, the emotional philosophy that emerged from his darkest hours and became his greatest strength. For those with the courage to examine their own attachments, to face reality without comforting illusions, and to surrender what cannot be held in service of what might be gained, these principles offer a path to genuine invulnerability, not the false invulnerability of those who refuse to be touched by the world, but the true invulnerability of those who engage with the world from a position of internal freedom that no external force can compromise. The choice remains what it was for Machiavelli in his cold study in 1513, to cling to weakness in the name of strength, or to embrace the apparent cruelty of letting go in service of a deeper kindness toward one's own potential. The man who destroys his weak self does indeed become indestructible, but only because he has discovered that his true self was never as fragile as he feared.